I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For those who didn't know, that was actually the Chair of Parliament's Finance and Expenditure Committee. A frightening thought. He said that there are things that are working in Hamilton. Well, I can tell you this, the statue of riffraff that stands in the main street of Hamilton is working harder than the member for Hamilton West is for Hamilton. To stand up and give a speech... Oh, no, that is true. Hamilton East, I apologise to Mr McIndoe. The member for Hamilton East stands up to take a call in the budget debate, to stand here and tell New Zealanders what great plans they have for the New Zealand economy, how they will lift New Zealand out of an economic downturn, and instead we have a speech from the member for Hamilton East about the fact that he can't understand the policies of other parties, about the fact that he is unable to articulate what this budget will do to drive New Zealand's economy forward. And that, unfortunately, Mr Speaker, is the story of this budget. It's very important when we look at the budget to take a look at the downside scenarios. These are the things that Treasury and the Minister of Finance tell New Zealanders are unlikely to happen, the worst possible outcome of this budget. And if we look at those downside scenarios, Mr Speaker, we see GDP in 2015 of 3.3% and GDP in 2016 of 2.4%. Already, the government's had to admit that the worst possible outcome from this budget is actually not even going to be the best possible outcome. Their forecasts are telling them they'll scrape towards 2% growth in 2015 and 2016. Westpac economist Dominic Stevens has said it won't even get up to 2% in that 2016 year. So the worst case scenario in the budget is the very one that's now playing out. And the reaction of the government and of Bill English to sit on his hands, to say it's all fine, watch out for those automatic stabilisers, they'll sort everything out. Well, the reality is, Mr Speaker, they're not sorting everything out. And indicator after indicator in our economy is showing that this budget is a failure. Big on politics, big on spin, and very, very small on the policies that will actually grow the New Zealand economy. But we look again at the downside scenario in the budget, Mr Speaker. Unemployment forecast in 2015 to go down to 5.6% and in 2016 to 5.1%. The latest household labour force survey says we're up to 5.9%. 146,000 New Zealanders out of work. 11,000 more New Zealanders out of work at this time this year than it was at the same time last year. And then the forecast for 5.1% in 2016. Again, commentators right across the spectrum are forecasting unemployment to keep rising. And the Westpac survey last week said 6.5% will be the unemployment rate. That is worse than the worst case scenario in this budget. So for speakers on the National Party side of the House to stand up and proclaim that this budget is somehow going to lead New Zealand into a strong economic future simply isn't backed up by the facts. They're now going to have to look at all of those forecast scenarios and bring in the downside scenario. That is the story of this government. That is the story of this budget. Now, Mr Speaker, we were told by the Prime Minister that we were on the cusp of something special, that we were on the cusp of an economy that was going to deliver to New Zealanders. And the reality is that has not happened, because there are three stools to this National Party government's economic approach, three legs to the stool. The first leg of those has already been kicked out. That was the dairy boom. And make no mistake, Mr Speaker, the National Party was fully prepared to take credit for when dairy prices went up. Day after day, Bill English would come into this House and tell us how well the economy was doing when farmers were getting payouts at the $8.40 level. But now, when those payouts are forecast to go down to $3.85, all of a sudden it's everybody else's fault. All of a sudden it's nothing that the government could have foreseen. Well, that is simply untrue. A Goldman Sachs report that came out in June last year warned of a 5-year global dairy glut. When that was raised with Stephen Joyce, he laughed. He laughed at the prospect that the one thing that was truly propping up the New Zealand economy was on its way down. And now, when the chickens have come home to roost or the cows have come back into the yard, Stephen Joyce has no plan B. because that key leg of the economic stool is gone. And all the talk about the fact that suddenly we found a tourism industry, suddenly the wine industry and ICT are the answer, put together, all of those things won't match what's been lost in terms of dairy. And that's because after 7 years, the word diversification finally leaves Bill English's lips. He finally says that's what the economy should be about, and it hasn't happened. And that's why not only are the opposition parties calling for a plan B for the economy, but so are groups like Federated Farmers, so are 75% of the CEOs in the Mood of the Boardroom survey. They're saying plan A's not working, and where is plan B? And we see none of that from the government. And that's because the other two legs of the stool still make them believe that there's something happening in the economy. The Canterbury rebuild. What's quite clear about the Canterbury rebuild now is that it will stop adding to the growth story this year if it hasn't already. That doesn't mean that there aren't projects happening in Canterbury. What that means is there's not new activity going to be coming on stream. And by the end of 2017, economists are now telling us that the Canterbury rebuild will actually be a drag on the New Zealand economy, because we haven't seen out of this government a proper plan for economic development in Canterbury. The rebuild isn't a plan, it comes to an end. And there's no sign from this government that they've got any replacement for that. The Canterbury rebuild's been responsible for about a third of the growth rate in the last few years, and it's gone. And so the second leg of the stool is gone. And the third leg of the stool of the National Party's approach to the economy is the one that's remaining, and it's the Auckland housing bubble. And in this budget, we looked for the answers from the government that they could respond to the huge supply and demand problem in Auckland housing, and it wasn't there. What we got was half-baked ideas from Nick Smith to build on power stations and in cemeteries, but we saw nothing real in terms of getting the supply of housing that Aucklanders need, dealing with the 20,000 house deficit that Auckland already has, plus the 10,000 a year that they need to build. No sign of that. The government could have picked up some ideas from Labor. They talk a lot about plagiarism on that side of the House today, Mr Speaker. Well, they plagiarised Labor's ideas for years. Working for families, interest-free student loans, early childhood education. We just had the immigration policy the other day. Well, I invite them to plagiarise the Kiwi Build policy, because that would actually get some house building going. That would actually stimulate the economy. That would actually start to deal with the Auckland housing crisis, but instead Nick Smith keeps his head in the sand. And on the demand side, the government's great agenda of getting a register of foreign buyers, except it's not really a register, and when we come to debate that bill in the House, Mr Speaker, we'll see all of the holes in that. No real plan to crack down on the speculators who are driving up Auckland housing prices. And that bubble, Mr Speaker, will burst at some point. It will happen, and that's the final leg of the stool in terms of the National Party's approach to the economy. So this budget is not about a plan for New Zealand's future. It's not about making sure that we build the skills, that we get the technology that we need, that we have the infrastructure that we need. It's a piece of political spin. Clever politics to be able to stand up here and say, we've increased benefits for the first time in 46 years, even though that's not true. Even though the fact that those on the lowest incomes in New Zealand benefited from working for families, that was a significant increase denied. But that's what this budget's about, Mr Speaker. It's about spin. New Zealanders deserve better than this. New Zealanders deserve a government that won't sit on its hands, that won't sit on the sidelines, but actually works as a partner. And this is starting to happen in the regions, Mr Speaker. Every time Labor MPs go out into the regions now, what we hear is, we don't want you to come and tell us what to do. We want to work with central government, local government, central government and businesses in the regions to grow the jobs that New Zealanders want, to grow the jobs that will deliver sustainable wages to New Zealanders. And that plea falls on deaf ears on that side of the House. If all of the mayors, all of the business leaders in the regions, their message is consistent. They want a government to be a partner. They don't have that from the national government. They will have that from the Labor government, Mr. Speaker. We needed a budget that had a plan to diversify the economy, to grow the regions, to build housing, to build skills, and to prepare New Zealanders for the future of work. None of those things are in this budget, Mr. Speaker. This is a wasted opportunity from a government who is out of ideas.